So writing in really any capacity is not easy, and everybody's got a different process. So, you've clicked on this video because the title is something like how to write a sci-fi novel in, 6 easy steps. My process is probably going to be very different from what you're expecting. I find that it is far easier for me to develop characters, to figure out how they interact with one another, how the world feels in screenplay format, before ever moving to more traditional literary prose. So that's actually the first step of this process that we're going to talk about on this journey of how it's taken me, 7-ish years to write a sci-fi novel. It's because those first couple years, the novel was a screenplay. So let's dive right into it. So sometime circa the summer of 2013, I enrolled in a screenwriting class in college. Knowing a little bit about the class from folks on my hall who'd already completed it, over winter break I began conceptualizing the story of the screenplay I would eventually write in the spring. I knew it would be science fiction, but I wanted to come up with something unique. I'd heard a while ago a bit of writing advice often attributed to Joss Whedon, so do with that what you will, and I've never confirmed if he actually said it or not, that the most important thing when writing sci-fi is to establish the rules of your universe, and then rigidly adhere to them. Regardless of how ridiculous these rules are, if you stick to them, the audience will buy it. I've also heard this concept summarized by the phrase, fictional consistency. I wanted my audience to be captivated, not confused, so my first step was just figuring out what was going to exist in this sci-fi universe and how it would work. I knew early on that it was going to be in the Milky Way, in the near future, not some Dune 10,000 years in the future or Star Wars a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. But then what? Are there robots, AI, lasers, light speed? What? These were the questions I was asking myself as I dreamt of this world of the future. I'd recently reread Michael Crichton's State of Fear, a story of an eco-terrorist plot to create natural disasters that will force people to pay attention to global warming. To my memory, there hadn't been a lot of environmentally focused science fiction, at least not of the spacefaring variety, and I hadn't yet read any of the novels of Jeff Vandermeer. And most stories of environmental collapse that I knew of were more ground level, to show how people were actually being affected. But how would that play out in space? What sort of ecological disaster could occur on that scale? The collapse of the sun? Well, sure, maybe. What if the sun collapsed into a wormhole? What would that look like for the galaxy at large? So I had one interesting plot point, a wormhole in the sun. Follow-up question: how? Well, thinking back on most real-world environmental disasters, they're often caused by out-of-control corporations or some sort of industrial interference. So perhaps a big mega-corporation did something to collapse the sun, but what? That answer requires a short world-building tangent of the question of lightspeed travel in my universe. Would it exist? Yes. But I figured such engines required phenomenally powerful reactions and fuel. I imagined a company, Meyer Engineering, that might have thought to siphon gases from the sun to fuel their fleet of starships. Without necessary regulatory oversight, Meyer harvested too much, and the sun began to collapse in on itself, forming the black hole, which for the sake of my story would function not like a literal black hole, but a fictional wormhole. And none of this was remotely grounded, obviously, in any sort of scientific fact, but few sci-fi stories are. Looking back on this plot point, though, it's real stupid. It's very different now, and we'll get to that later. So I had my disaster, and I had perpetrators. Now I needed heroes and villains. The villains actually came first. With such a massive environmental catastrophe, certainly there would be folks demanding those who caused it be brought to justice. I created a group called the Emissaries of Ra, who, though originally intended to be a kind of eco-terrorist group, quickly turned into a kind of religious sun-worshipping space cult. And in hindsight, this idea, too, also kind of dumb. And it has changed significantly since then. I gave this cult a leader, Father Solomon Thomas, who had made it his life's goal to hunt down every single Meyer Engineering employee, even tangentially involved with the harvesting project that destroyed the sun. So, disaster, perpetrators, villains, now we needed some heroes. I looked to classic science fiction ensembles for inspiration. How many characters would I need to develop? I looked to Ridley Scott's Alien, where aboard Scott's Nostromo were 7 crew members, each with their own role aboard the ship. Han Solo's crew on the Millennium Falcon was classically just 2 smugglers, though Han's YT model freighter was obviously intended to be crewed by more, since the bridge had 4 seats and elsewhere on the ship were 2 gunner positions for theoretically a minimum crew of 6. The Serenity from Joss Whedon's short-lived Firefly had a crew of 5, not including the 4 passengers that accompanied them on many of their voyages. Now, I hadn't at the time read any of the novels in the Expanse saga, but Corey's Rocinante had a crew of 4, at least during the events of the first novel. And then you had your bigger ensembles like on shows like Star Trek, Babylon 5, or Battlestar Galactica. And I realized at that point that the size of my crew would somewhat be determined by the size of their ship. I knew pretty early on that I didn't want the hero ship to be a big battleship, and that it would likely be something smaller like the Serenity or the Millennium Falcon. I was also playing a lot of EVE Online at the time, and I pictured the hero ship being of a comparable size to the Galente Algos class destroyer I'd grown accustomed to flying. So that's what the Holosun became, both in size and spirit. I decided my ship, much like the ships that inspired it, would be an old freighter, and my crew would be shipping supplies in and out of the wormhole that had formed in the wake of the sun's collapse. Now it was easy to figure out how many main characters I would have, because it would be however many roles on the ship needed to be filled. I decided the Holosun would have a captain, a pilot, a communications officer, a weapons specialist, and 2 engineers. The 2 engineers were, at both times, an homage to Alien and explained away in the backstory as necessitated by the state of the ship's systems. The Holosun was going to be an old freighter, but converted and augmented with many new systems in the years since it entered private service. 1 engineer would manage the old systems, and 1 would manage the new. They'd also be comic relief. I soon decided the pilot and the communications officer would be brother and sister, and the captain and the weapons officer would be the oldest on the ship, both hardened and battle-worn women who commanded the respect of everyone else aboard. So the crew of 6 became Ariel Anderson, the captain, Max Hillis, the pilot, Joan Hillis, the communications officer, Catherine Adams, the weapons officer, Thaddeus Schmidt, whose last name would end up changed in future iterations, would be the engineer of the old systems, and Jonathan Douglas would be the engineer of the new systems. From here, each character's backstories began to organically develop. I needed a reason for these characters to have a run-in with the antagonists, so I decided that Ariel be a former Meyer Engineering contractor. I had minor backstory information for a lot of other characters written down in some physical documents, and though I'm sure they're still in a box somewhere, I currently do not know where such documents might be. In initial outlines, the plot was very derivative of other things I'd recently watched, namely The Empire Strikes Back and Die Hard. As I began formulating how the crew of the Holosun might encounter the emissaries of Ra, Empire was a key inspiration. Beyond the black hole, which I called the Pass in the long and rich tradition of sci-fi writers just slapping the in front of a random noun to create places and things for their worlds, I created Achilles Station, a harbor built within warp distance of the other side of the cosmic gate for the sole purpose of supplying new colony ships with the resources they'd need to travel further into the new galaxy. Achilles was Cloud City on Bespin, and the emissaries were Vader's Imperial forces, deftly infiltrating the innocent harbor before our heroes arrive. I decided to add another layer to Ariel's character and give her an ex-husband, Edward Anderson, the man who would oversee the operation of Achilles. In the first draft of this story, Edward was 2,000% just Lando Calrissian light. In the screenwriting class, we wrote our scripts 10 pages at a time with the goal of having over 90 pages by the end of the class. The rule of thumb when writing a feature-length screenplay is to expect every page of the script to occupy 1 minute of screen time. This is not a hard and fast rule, but an average of most published and produced feature-length screenplays. So, since most feature-length films aim to be 90+ minutes, 90 to 100 pages is a good goal to hit. 100 pages, 40 scenes, 40 bullet points for your outline. So the first 10 pages I wrote even before the screenwriting class began were of a chase between the Holosun and a random emissary ship, just to have a moment to establish the characters, the antagonists, and the rules of the universe. I really liked these pages, and eventually we used them to shoot a short film version of The Hollow Sun, but more on that later. In class, we'd do read-throughs of the pages we'd written that week, which was helpful for a few reasons. Firstly, we'd actually get to hear real people saying our dialogue. The screenplays, unlike more prosaic forms of writing, are not meant just to be read. They're meant to be spoken. So even if a line reads really well in your head, you may find it sounds weird when someone says it aloud. This was often true of my dialogue. Secondly, having the same people read for the same characters each week gave me fresh inspiration for further developments to each character. In fact, two of the folks who were in this screenwriting class with me ended up reprising their roles in the short film version we shot later that year. So from those first 10 pages, I sent the crew of the Hollow Sun to Achilles Station and to Edward to pick up supplies necessary for their voyage. While docked on Achilles, the station is boarded by the emissaries, and then the story descends into Die Hard-esque shenanigans. The crew gets separated, and then they have to stealthily work their way back to each other from disparate parts of the station. This first draft changed a fair amount from start to finish, with some scenes read in class getting dramatically reworked in later weeks. Like a scene involving one character jumping from one spaceship to another spaceship during a chase in deep space. It was a hastily written scene and was cut shortly after. A montage at the beginning of the film explaining some of the narrative backstory actually came about close to the end of the writing process, with some of that exposition having been ham-fistedly included in character dialogue, but I realized an opening montage would be slightly more elegant and efficient. When all was said and done, this first screenplay of The Hollow Sun was well received by my peers, which gave me the motivation to continue polishing it in the months that followed. I didn't hit the 90-page class goal, but wasn't marked off for it since my 85 pages told a coherent story in all the proper ways we'd studied in class. Its slightly lower page count was due in part to how I'd written action description, which was often succinct and would, in real-world production, take much less time to read than it would to play out on screen in real time. Looking back on this version of the script, there were definitely moments that betrayed my immaturity as a writer. Much of the violence was more visceral than necessary, with things happening more for shock value than anything else. The novelization of the screenplay does contain abrupt and visceral violence, but it's much more sparsely peppered throughout the narrative to maximize its impact. If everything is chaotically violent, then the violence loses its edge, which was the case in my first draft. One scene where someone shattered a prisoner's kneecap with a wrench didn't last through the first round of revisions. So I began a second draft shortly after the semester ended, and by the end of summer 2014, not many key plot points had changed, but planning had begun in earnest on the next step of the Hollow Sun's journey, its short film adaptation. So this is not a step in the process that I have repeated at any point since, but just due to the nature of where I was in my life at the time, geographically as well as developmentally, the next step in this process is shooting a short film of a portion of your screenplay. So why did we shoot a short of The Hollow Sun? Well, following the track of the production classes I was in, the same semester I took screenwriting, I was in a class called Digital Field Production, or DFP for short, in which I got my first taste of directing. Until that point, all my experience in filmmaking was acting in front of the camera, unless you count the terrible spy thrillers I made in my preteen years. So directing was a new world for me, and I liked it. And I decided I'd take the Intro to Directing class in the fall, which I knew had a final project of creating a short film. And ever since I'd written those first 10 pages in late 2013, I knew I wanted to put them on screen. Now, my biggest regret looking back on the actual production of this short is the script, ironically enough. With all the effort we put into the set, music, effects, all the technical stuff of the movie, I should have gone back and written new pages just for this short. Pages with real arcs for the characters, rather than just pages that introduced them to a greater story. The pages we shot were fine in the context of the feature-length script, but less than ideal for a short film, and I should have seen that before we actually began shooting. Now, we actually have a how-to video on our model-making process here on the channel, and though we thought the shotgun mic for the camera was on, it wasn't, so just know that if you go watch it. Post-production on The Hollow Sun took the better part of the end of the fall 2014 semester and even extended into spring 2015 in preparation for the yearly school film festival. I edited the short, my brother wrote the music, and my roommate Carson did the sound design. Now, the version of this short film that exists here on the channel is that version that was shown at the Highbridge Film Festival. People seemed to enjoy it, but it was much different than the usual student fare. I ended up submitting the short to a handful of local film festivals, but to no avail. However, the story was still kicking around in my brain, and I quickly began rewriting the screenplay into a newer, fresher version. Now, I can't 100% remember, but I think I must have just totally begun writing a whole new screenplay, because I don't know what reason I would have to have changed the title from The Hollow Sun to a stylized all caps The Hollow Sun on the title page. But regardless of that, I had some ideas for how to evolve the story. Changes that were informed by the making of the short film, and the story just, rattling around in my head for several years now. Firstly, lightspeed travel was out the window. I wanted to lean more into hard sci-fi, or as hard as it could be while still relying on astronomical impossibilities like wormholes to move the plot along. But since lightspeed travel and the machines capable of traveling at such speeds were the original reason Meyer Engineering siphoned gases from the sun and collapsed it, I needed a new reason for a wormhole to have opened up at the center of the galaxy. And that reason came in the form of a different kind of industrial accident. No longer would it be a mining accident, but instead Meyer Engineering would develop, a prototype Stargate generator, essentially, that would create the wormhole embedded in the surface of the sun, no longer collapsing it, just kind of existing alongside it, almost. With the cosmic disaster of my story changed from the total collapse of the sun to a smaller warp bubble nestled into the surface, I decided that humanity would have tried to come up with a way to stabilize the anomaly in order to capitalize upon it as a shipping lane, like an interstellar Panama Canal. Thus were born the sister Achilles stations, Achilles 1 and Achilles 2, one on each side of the wormhole. Achilles 1 would just be an orbital station acting as a gatekeeper of the wormhole, and Achilles 2 would actually be a massive ring station built around the other side of the wormhole, a harbor from which incoming and outgoing vessels could stop and refuel before the rest of their journey. Achilles 2 would be a gateway to the galaxies beyond the pass, and still somewhat akin to Bespin's Cloud City, though Edward was far less Lando-y in this draft of the story. Solomon II and all the emissaries became much less a religious cult and more a generic space terrorist organization. Emissaries of Ra became the Emissary Coalition. All the emissaries still called Solomon father, like in the first draft, not dad father, but religious father, like a, Catholic, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned, blah, blah, blah. But in the book, he simply becomes Admiral. In the novelization, too, the Emissary Coalition would simply become the Coalition, another the plus noun equals sci-fi thing. Other smaller changes punctuated the new story beats. Jonathan and Thaddeus swapped personalities for what reason I don't recall, and Catherine became a much more distinct character and one of my favorites to write. The biggest changes happened in the third act, where I essentially rewrote and recontextualized the whole ending of the story. Now, this version of the script, dated May 14, 2016, was a crisp 97 pages, up from the original draft's 85. This version of the script heavily informed the story of the novelization, and the outline for the book was generated using this screenplay as a template. And you can read this draft of the screenplay in a link below. From this point, the story would sit for a few months, percolating in my mind while I worked up the courage to pursue a novelization of the story of The Hollow Sun. I commissioned some artwork too during this time, mostly character concepts, which would go on to further inform how I would write the characters in the novelization. I feel like I've used the word inform too many times here in this video, but whatever. You can also find a link to all the artists I've commissioned over the course of this process down in the description below. Now, though months and years now had passed since I completed the short film and the new feature-length screenplay of The Hollow Sun, the story persisted in my mind. Phil Lambert, my director of photography on the short, and I had come up with a number of new stories in the years after we made The Hollow Sun, and though I can't recall which one of us had the idea first, we both decided at some point it would be fun to try to novelize some of our screenplays. And obviously I chose the one I was most intimately familiar with. Now, I'd had no formal writing or literary training beyond some creative writing classes and my screenwriting class, so I had no idea about the actual building blocks of a novel beyond my own knowledge of books I enjoyed. The longest prose I'd written up to this point was 4,000 words from my creative writing class at Seminole State, and some quick Googling brought up multiple sources that cited common minimum novel length as 40,000 words, though it seemed like 50 to 60 was the standard for more recent novels. So I had a goal, 40,000 words. Another minor goal was to have each chapter be at least 3,000 words, since I'd seen a few literary blogs and whatnot cite that number as the sweet spot for individual chapters. Tangentially, this did get me interested in how many words my screenplays actually were, since they're, mostly dialogue, and I was surprised to discover my first draft was 14,232 words, and my May 2016 draft was 15,258. So I began the first draft of the novelization in a Google document on February 21st, 2017. A few more key things about the story had changed before I even put the first words down on paper. Firstly, the story leaned even further into hard sci-fi. Even after I'd removed lightspeed travel and stars that collapse without going supernova, my screenplay still played pretty fast and loose with how fast everybody traveled from one part of the galaxy to another, bridging the space between Jupiter and the Sun within the span of one conversation, which is not possible. But since the warp bubble between our galaxy and this new galaxy beyond it was fairly integral to the plot of my book, both for the flow of the narrative and for the characters' motivations and backstories, I felt like I still needed to keep it around, but perhaps I could ground it in some sort of real-world theory of warp travel, which led me to discover the Alcubierre Drive. I stumbled upon this neat little bit of theoretical astrophysics from Mexican astrophysicist Miguel Alcubierre, who'd come up with an idea for apparent faster-than-light travel without actually needing to accelerate to the speed of light. Instead, ships with this kind of drive would compress and expand space-time in front of and behind them, respectively, effectively traveling, quote-unquote, faster than light, but in reality not moving at all. Think of it like a wrinkle in time, or the space folding in Dune. This was how my warp tunnel would form on the surface of the sun, a warp drive test gone wrong. It could still fulfill the industrial disaster element, but also kind of ground the disaster in reality. And so finally, the first bunch of words were typed for the Hollow Sun's novelization, however many minutes into this video we actually are now. The first document I have archived from this endeavor covers little more than the first act of the story, but clocks in at 16,557 words, so I'd already gone a step above my longest screenplay, and just in the first act. This initial draft of the story also most closely matches the format of the May 2016 screenplay, jumping between characters in the midst of story beats, much as a screenplay intercuts action beats into one another. Now, a little over a year later, I had a proper first draft. A 45,786 word document created on January 4th, 2018 contains the whole of the narrative, though in many places is quite hastily and shoddily written in order to just have the skeleton of the story actually written down. Now, one big format change was one I stole from James S. A. Corey's The Expanse novels. Instead of jumping between characters amidst the action of each chapter, as would be normal in a screenplay, I gave each chapter a single perspective from a single character. This allowed me to document events in the book from multiple characters' perspectives, and allowed me to explore the world of the Hollow Sun from many different angles, not just the one of the omniscient narrator. But while this 46,000 word document fulfilled my goal of cresting the 40,000 word threshold of, quote, novel status, not all the chapters were 3,000 words, my secondary goal. In fact, some were less than 1,000. So that was the goal of the second draft, hit 3,000 words per chapter. Now, this process took much longer because the 46,000 words I already had were the story. So most of the new words I added were all character development and world building, which I love. Now, suddenly, bits of this world that only existed in my mind were able to be fleshed out on the page. The galactic governments of this world began to take shape, and the various spacefaring corporations that ferried goods across the solar system too found themselves memorialized and more often than not vilified in the pages of the Hollow Sun. It did kind of feel like writing fan fiction for my own universe, but I like what I was able to come up with. During this process of chapter expansion, I commissioned even more concept art. The goal of getting this story on screen has always been at the forefront of my mind, so in the years since first conceptualizing these characters, I've periodically tapped talented concept artists to bring my worlds to life. So almost 2 years after finishing the first draft of my novel, on January 18th, 2020, I finally had a manuscript that almost fulfilled the 3,000 words per chapter requirement. This new draft tacked on a few thousand more words, bringing the early 2020 draft to a rollicking 64,600 words. Around this time, I'd begun actually considering getting my manuscript in front of an editor, since the idea of publishing now seemed like an attainable goal, even if just self-publishing. A friend of mine, Kat Kaiser, ended up being that editor, and we began the formal editing process in April of 2020. As we polished the early chapters of the book and adjusted story beats and character beats here and there, I began looking more closely at some of the later chapters, amending things to reflect new changes or fleshing out plot points as Kat and I came up with new ideas for the story. Now, one of the interesting parts of the editing process was seeing which paragraphs or chapters Kat would pick up on as particularly good passages of prose. And to my pleasant surprise, most of the added world building, elaborating on bits of history amongst the interstellar governments and corporations, were ones Kat picked out as bits of particularly good writing. Now, it may be no surprise at this point, but during this editing process, I commissioned even more concept art. And as the editing process continued, the final chapters of the book underwent severe restructuring and rewriting. Chapter 18 has undergone more rewriting than literally any other part of the book, but as of early 2021, it was finally at a place where it matched the quality of the rest of the book. As of September 2021, editing of The Hollow Sun was completed. The book is totally done, and now has begun the arduous and somewhat obtuse process of finding an agent to represent the book to publishers. This has been fairly tricky, as not all literary agents have an interest in representing science fiction, and even those who do sometimes don't want to represent the specific style of speculative science fiction I'm peddling, and some of the agents who would be interested aren't open for queries. So compiling a list of agents who are A, open to queries, B, interested in repping sci-fi, and C, are interested in repping this brand of sci-fi has been a struggle. But I spent the bulk of September 2021 sending out query letters to agents I could find who matched these three qualifiers, and hopefully one of them will respond with interest in representing me in my novel. And that is, in as brief a form as I can manage, how I wrote my first science fiction novel. Hopefully some of this very long-winded, circuitous journey has been helpful to you. Feel free to leave questions in the comments, which I will do my best to answer, and I will probably do some more writing videos as this process goes along. So this has been Jake Terrio with Terrio Studios, wishing you safe flying.